Hello. Welcome to the very first Just Us live stream. I don't know. We've done this before, but not in this way. My name is Aicila. This is the BiCurean Consulting podcast, which is a totally different thing, although officially it's not that yet even. It's just to hang out with Carmell. And then this is my colleague and good friend, Carmel Clark. I'm going to talk a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, I'm so excited that you and I are doing this. You've talked about this for a long time, and you know that I'm down for any adventure with you. That's always there's a long history between us. But so I am a transformational coach, and I founded the Center for Transformational Influence, which for me is a way to move forward these ideas that are so important that I think get twisted in their normal delivery out there. A lot of times, these ideas of how we transform our lives. So everybody, keeps attaching the transformations to lifestyle and bank account when in fact that's really not what transformation is all about. And so the work of Center for Transformational Influence is really to challenge us back into this lane of fulfillment inside of us in our lives by understanding what the work of transformation is for us, really, whether it's personally or in our relationships or in our jobs, our careers, or even organizationally. I work with organizations and people in organizations as well, to be able to change the ideas of what transformation is, and then also to teach us, for us all to be able to learn and practice true influence. We all have influence. And the problem that I see too often is that we equate social authority or money with influence, right? All too often, money, status, social authority. And that isn't what influence really is. If we give it that credit, then we end up off track, all of us. But really understand what influence is inside of us, and we show up to that with radical self-responsibility and accountability, and that we understand the power that we have and the ability that we have to make things better if we use that influence effectively, and then how to use it effectively, then everybody benefits. And that's what I teach as well. So I know it's probably a longer explanation.
That's great. I think it's really great. And we'll talk more. I'm taking notes, so we'll put some of this stuff obviously in the notes so people can find you, because I'm sure they will want to. And we're going to start with is just obviously acknowledging the day, which is it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I saw a video on Friday, I believe it was from his daughter, Bernice, talking about their family's perspective on celebration for today. I wasn't able to find that, so I'm not going to share it. At this point, there are too many videos about just today. But one of the things that they were talking about that I thought was really important to acknowledge is that they said, no celebration without legislation, which is that I read some of the articles and stuff, but basically saying, as a family, and honestly, I think as community members, for me, while I am not Black, I have my own perspective on the frustration of we've been really working on this for a long time, and it seems like instead of moving forward, we're backsliding. And so, it's difficult to say, well, let's celebrate and have a barbecue, when actually, while of course his legacy is a really important one, the best way to honor it is to continue to bring equity and justice to more of these systems, and to include more people in our social change efforts, and to really acknowledge and honor the experience of Black people in our communities that, they have often to fight so hard to get people to pay attention to what they're experiencing. It can be difficult to then take action. So how do we show up as white people who believe, or, even wherever you stand, but that for me that's my identity, to show up and say, all right, I hear you. I'm going to take some actions. What actions are there right now? The action they're saying is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seems pretty basic to me. Like, we're a democracy, let's have equal access to voting. So
make sure that's the standard, instead of just saying let's have equal access to voting, but to ensure that we have equal access. Like, the measurement on the other end is the true tell. Like, there's so much lip service that's always given, right?
Mhm.
So, uh, so this is the measurement, right? Making
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah, equal access, and that's, yeah, and that it's a guarantee. And I'm not, I mean, it's difficult because there's a little bit of preaching to the choir, and I do think that that feeling of constantly um having to, hello, Dr. Student Ben, nice to see you. But that when you're constantly having to prove to people that your experience is real, I think we need to stop that and just say, like, if someone says their experience, okay, it's real, they don't have access. What do we do to change that? We're a democracy, or at least we claim to want to be one. And
Right.
therefore, that's just a basic tenet, is that access. I've been privileged to live in 2 states that do permanent mail-in ballots, and I will tell you, I forgot what it was to go. I went to a caucus, I want to say 4 years, 3 years ago. I don't think it was a presidential election. Maybe it was. And I was like, wow, like this is hard, and it's just a caucus. And I had to be there for 4 hours, and I didn't have to stand in line. And I was like, man, like if this was what I had to do to vote, would I do it? I don't know. Like I haven't had to do that in my adult life. I get to sit at my kitchen table and fill out my ballot and look up the news reports and like the different analyses. Like it might take me 4 or 5 hours over the course of a few days, but I feel confident that I have appropriately voted my values and my assessment of what's happening. If I had to stand in line and in a booth, and I don't know, like that would be really hard. I don't understand the objection people have to mail-in ballots personally. They feel like the best way to get informed results, but maybe that's the objection. I don't know.
I think it's just not something that people are accustomed to, and then there's a lot of politicization around something that people are not accustomed to, and so it gets swayed that way, right? Like that's historically what's happened on so many different things, so many different issues. And I think that, just like anything else, we have to get down to actual facts and look at what facts are, right?
Mhm.
That, we have a system that really works, a system that delivers multi-partisan results consistently, state by state, again and again and again, every year that we have elections. And I think that, for me, I may have my internal struggles with the outcomes of an election, but I have also the same prerogative to be invested in, which I have done sometime, invested in what the process of an election actually is.
Mhm.
And when people really become more invested in the process of the election locally, what they find is that people of all different persuasions are working together to create a free and fair election again
Mhm.
and again and again. And that's where I feel like my faith in the democracy that we have really lives as I watch that play out state by state. It doesn't matter if it's a red state or a blue state or a purple state. Again and again, if you go into the actual election processes and the people who are showing up, volunteering their time, and faithfully executing those duties of a free and fair election, they're working together. That to me is the true faith that I have in our democracy again and again. So I think that the mail-in ballot, is it's kind of in a way it's a red herring, isn't it? Right?
Mhm.
Like really the challenge is for us to be more actively invested in a free and fair election, in participating and volunteering and in good faith showing up in those places to do that.
Yeah, well, and that I feel like it's, once again, that indication that the lip service has to stop. Like we saw it after all the protests in 2020, where a lot of companies really did start talking about being more engaged. But yeah, I've seen it over my life being involved in different social justice issues. Is that we are very much a country of marketers, and it's very intriguing to me. There was I can't recall. There was an article about gosh, I'm going to get it wrong, but it was an entity that had engaged in bad behavior. And instead of addressing the bad behavior, they hired a marketing firm. And and we're like, we're going to, and that was that moment where it was just like, oh, this is part of what we're dealing with, and part of like the messaging around today that felt so important to acknowledge was that it's tricky, right? Because we live in a society that is so image oriented and so focused on how things look, that we can sometimes, it seems like, find a solution to how things look rather than how things are. and and that's, it's not that things looking a certain way is necessarily all by itself bad. Like I get that we take social cues from how things are set up, so it's difficult to say, well, it's a total demon. But we also need to really be clear that how things are is actually what's going to be what we're dealing with, and that just how things look isn't helpful to us. And that's, I think, part of what I see. Like, we've got commemorative coins, right? Like, and who's on your money does matter. And so like Maya Angelou's finally on a coin, but she's on the other side with George Washington, who has, was a slave owner. So it's like, it doesn't solve anything. And at the same time, yes, okay, we're getting some of that imaging that is so important to our culture. We have
Mhm.
Juneteenth now as an official holiday. Great. And I'm not saying these things aren't great. And the what I've heard from different like activists that I follow and folks that I know is there's a concern that because it looks like something, that the actual work will actually be disrupted. So we have to keep pushing for voting rights, and contacting our legislators and our representatives and our senators and saying, we actually want full access for everybody to be guaranteed, like whatever that looks like. I have my ideas about what that looks like, right? But really what it is that's what we want. That's what we want it to be. And then how it plays out, the communities can decide what's best for them.
I, you know, I think that we're having to figure this out as we take the steps, right? We're having to pave the road in front of us as we're walking, even though we know, I think, intuitively where it needs to go and where we want it to go. We're still, putting the bricks down as we go for how to create that, because, on the one side, when symbols are powerful, right? So, you
Mm-hmm.
know, Juneteenth it's a powerful symbol. What's continue? It's not the end of the deal, right?
Right.
What are the other pieces that go along with it, right? John Lewis
Mm-hmm.
Voting Rights Act and the and these other pieces as well. And are the people in our communities feeling safe? Are they feeling part of the community? Are they, how do we understand that from our perspectives? How do we participate in that as well? I mean, it seems to me that as we're working to figure it out, we're in the midst of it, and it can be really hard to see. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's hard because, we'll stand there with our flag and say this and that, but we're in the midst of figuring out what it's going to be and how it's going to look. Does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I also think that the other thing is that wait, and that's why I thought, especially talking to you today about it, is that when you talk about transformation, um, I mean, we need to transform our society, and it's one of the things that I've noted is there's like several aspects of what transformation is, and one is noticing that there are things happening that aren't working for people possibly other than you. Because I think that it's very easy. I used to do trainings, and we had an experiential training where we sort of set people up to kind of have this opportunity to understand what it is to be in a system that is not working for you. Like, we created a system for our training, and it was very powerful because the reality is that you are in your space. Like, your life is contained, and and the truth is, you don't also want to make assumptions about what's happening for other people. So several weeks ago, there was an incident where a friend of mine had some, and they live in a fairly, I would say, nicer suburban area, but they had police come and surround one of the houses in their neighborhood, like something you would see on television, like megaphones and come out with your hands up kind of thing. And another friend of mine was like, do we know why? Do we know what happened? And I was like, oh, actually, I'm not sure I do. Like, and the truth is, like, there's this assumption like that it's going according to the rules, right? But at the same time, I know from all of the things I see and my own experiences, that's not how it always works.
Right.
and so and so it's difficult though, but what do I do? Do I go out and interrupt that? Well, probably not. And yet at the same time, recognizing, that when they talked about that, there's that famous quote about the Holocaust, first they came for these people and then these people and then these people, and then they came for me and there was no one to protest. But I wouldn't know if somebody in my neighborhood, we don't tend to be close to our neighbors and talk to them. So I think that the transformation in some ways is like about getting to know the people directly around you and kind of getting some sense of them. And I know you've always been really good about that, but to me, it's a very interesting question. Like, because at the same time, like you said, like, I'm not just going to randomly go and barge in on people and what they're doing in their lives. That's not necessarily any better.
Right.
So how do we do that? And I think it's because we have to get to know people. Then we know, oh, Sam's not here. Where's he been? It's been a week. But if we don't know each other, we're not interacting with people around us. I don't know. I think we're at a higher level of vulnerability, maybe.
I think so too. And I think that that's, I don't want to, get off on a tangent on this, but, the hyper individuation or hyper individualism that we have in the United States as part of our culture has really, really led us to more of this place where we are now in many ways. And I'm not saying that's the only reason. I'm just saying it is one factor. I look at the fact, like I moved into the place that I'm in right now, not quite a year ago, and we've had problems with the front door, with the mailroom and packages being stolen, haven't we? And so it's interesting that I know all the people, there aren't that many of us that are, have places on this floor that I'm on, and they'll drop my packages off outside my door, which is a much, there are only 4 of us here. And so it's a much safer space than, the possibility of the package being taken from the mailroom. And I looked at that and I thought, that just happened automatically. How did that happen? Somebody thinking, well, it's going to be better if I just leave those there for her because we all know each other and those packages will be safe versus I'm going to leave them in the mailroom where they have a much higher likelihood of being stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And that could only, most likely only be possible from the interactions that we've had, the communication, the getting to know each other, the spending time to talk and be really interested, not just the hi, as we pass in the hallway, so to speak. And I think that this place of getting to know each other is the thing that starts to break down barriers. So, if I only get to know the people who agree with me, or I only get to know the people that are in one small sphere of my world, then I think that really, for the most part, is as far as my perspectives and thinking can go, right? Unless
Mm-hmm.
I push myself to go further, even if I don't have access to people living in third world countries to have conversations with them, for example, to gather more information there, still I can push out further from this much more cellular space that I am living in. And what is the value of that? Mark Twain said, travel is the enemy to bigotry and prejudice. But we don't have to leave our communities to travel. We can actually travel outside the small spaces, whether it's our own religion and our own congregation, or it's our own, our kids going to this school, or it's, this one neighborhood that we live in, for example. We can travel outside of those spaces and actually get to know people, really get to know people outside of those spheres. And when we do, our world expands. What
Mm-hmm.
we stand for is able to be more inclusive, and our ability to recognize perspectives other than our own deepens just naturally.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, and I know that you do a lot of work with folks around this, which is that there's a tendency to if then statement ourselves and others. So like, if you're this, then this must be true about you. And I have found that, for example, there's certain like reflexive, it's why we do the BiCurean podcast, which is that other podcast I've been doing for 4 years with my co-host Eric. And one of the reasons we do that is people like to live in this either or space in terms of how they live, and so, or how they think about things. It's kind of fundamentally a little bit how our brains work, and so there requires some effort to get outside of that. But it creates some assumptions. So if I say that I am pro Second Amendment rights, people immediately will assume several things are true about me. And I'm not saying that, just to be clear, like that's an if statement. If I were to say that, just to be clear, and we did a show on gun violence, and the whole scenario. Obviously, I did it the Aicila ways. It was very very researched, and in my perspective is I'm actually anti-slaughter. I'm not sitting in this dichotomy, the false dichotomy, in my opinion, of the pro Second Amendment like versus gun control. I don't think they have to be at odds with each other. I think you can have both. And what I'd like to do is focus the conversation on what I think we are all interested in, I would hope, which is to stop the slaughter and to stop ultimately the reasons that people think slaughtering others will solve their emotional problems. Like that's a fundamental issue that has to be addressed, which is that we have a swath of people in our country who are that damaged and like unsupported. And how do we address that? And it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment, right? Like, but it absolutely is affected by that situation. And so similarly, like if I meet somebody who has a different opinion, I don't have to assume that their stance means anything about how I live my life, what I think and believe. Like I can actually assume that's what they're doing because they think it's best for them. And as long as it's not directly impacting me, let it go. And I mean, there's obviously caveats, and I'm not going to get into them because any one of the things that I loved, a gentleman that I follow on Twitter was talking about. Oftentimes, people we quickly jump to the extremes, right? Like if I say like if it's not impacting me, let it go. Well, obviously, if I'm watching someone harm someone, that may not be directly impacting me. I'm not going to let that go. But people will jump to the extremes. And it's a very interesting and not necessarily helpful reaction, instead of recognizing like we can't judge anything by its extremes. Like, yes, we should anticipate the results of our choices and our actions. If the end result is going to be bad, let's pay attention to that. However, there are lots of things like, if I get antibiotics from my doctor and I take all of them at once, I could be harmed. Like it's not, there's always an extreme of something that can be harmful. So let's not also assume that's where we're going to go and stay here in this moment. What am I doing? How am I behaving? And how do I accept that your way of being is different from mine? That doesn't mean it's necessarily about me, maybe at all.
I think that it's difficult for us to cultivate that perspective, but it's also crucial that we learn how to do that. It really is crucial for us. In my traveling and living in different parts of the world and in different parts of the U.S. as well, I have continually found myself in the midst of people with such varying, different ideas. And even if they had one political persuasion or one person that they were supporting, if I got down into everything underneath it, it was so different and nuanced from somebody else, right? It wasn't the
Mm-hmm.
same. And then further from that, and this is the point for me that's so important, is I feel that our humanity should trump everything else. Like we should keep reaching to find with somebody else this space of common humanity. I believe that it's there. And somebody may say, "Oh, you're so Pollyanna about that." But my experience has been so far that that's the case. I mean, somebody may not want to open up to that connection, and that's fine, but they feel it. They know that
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm reaching for, is not to find, position of power in my interaction with them, but rather to be able to see them, to really acknowledge them, truly the person at the level of their humanity, of their existence, of their being. And I think that for me, that's at the core of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was all about, that we can't actually make the changes that are really going to matter if we don't first recognize that we each have a responsibility to reach for the common humanity between us. That is an act of self-respect first and foremost. If I'm reaching for the common humanity in you, then I am also touching my own respect for myself in doing so. And
Mhm.
that, I think, is really the way that we figure out what bricks need to be put on that path in front of us as we're figuring out how to create this future that we envision, but we're not there yet.
Mhm. No, I think that I mean, one, I think we do have to envision, or imagine what it would feel like in my case, uh, that future, and we have to know what we're working towards,
Yes.
and in terms of like being able to get there. I also feel like one of the things that, so for a long time I was in the queer community activist work, and I also had a very strong religious background, and so I often took on the role of speaking with religious folks about LGBT issues and activism and equity access, all of that. And I was really good at it because I had that history and I had a comfort with it. And then I got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. Like, I just hit a wall. I did it for like 10 years, and then I was like, oh, I'm done. I'm done. My ability and my strength for this. And I think that's something that, as folks who present as a white identified in some fashion, um learning to take that on, like, I have I had a conversation with a person a few years ago, and he was talking about going home to visit his family, and he's like, well, I don't really want to deal with it, so I don't want to talk to them, even though I know that they say things that are uncomfortable. And I was like, well, totally understand that. Like, and you have that choice in a way that people of color don't necessarily have. They don't get to not deal with it. Like that feeling you have of, oh, I just want a break. They have that feeling too. And they don't get to have it. They don't get the break.
That's actually,
Um, and
yes.
I'm obviously like, and shaming someone isn't necessarily gonna like motivate them to behave differently. However, it was just, it felt important to me to point that out. Like, of course you do. It's exhausting. and and I think it's great that you get that choice. And my point would be, I'd like other people to have that choice. Um, and to me, that means laboring in our world in a way that like, I did a post somewhere, probably Medium, who knows, on this process of saying, like, identifying the power that you have, right? In terms of, because what you were talking about, you don't want to get into, I personally don't find that whenever I am in what a power dynamic struggle with someone, it's really unlikely that anything genuinely connective, vulnerable, or transformational will happen. Like,
That's right.
that's usually not going to be successful. And sometimes you need to be in a power dynamic. Like, it's important to assert, like, this has to win. So I'm not going to say it's even always, it's just acknowledging like the outcome that you're likely to get from that engagement is very different than one where you don't need to establish some kind of like power play situation, because that vulnerability is harder to get to. And that's where the connection and the change can come.
That's right. That's right.
And at the same time, like, like, for those of us that have a choice about like having the conversation or not, being aware that it's, to me, part of it is about getting to a place where, like you said earlier, we're ensuring voting rights, where the conversation is no longer this systemic necessity, where everybody actually feels genuinely included. And of course, each individual is going to have an experience that is their unique experience. That's a different thing. But systemically, wouldn't it be great to live in a world where people actually felt that sense of true freedom? Like, I can't even imagine, and I want to be able to get some indication of what would it be like to live in a community where everybody felt that same freedom to risk, choose, to be secure enough to be free, to know that they had their basic necessities and access to a voice in how our social dynamics and legislative and legal system was working. What would that be like? I think it would be amazing. People get afraid of loss, and I get it. But I just don't think they like that. Like, what we would have so much more innovation. We would have so much cultural diversity. Like, we would have so many, I think, fewer criminal situations, because the people that are, having to like push in that way could turn to maybe more creative endeavors. Like, who knows what would happen if folks just felt that sense of security. And how
That's
do we get there? How do we actually create a scenario where people aren't afraid of that?
I think, I think you're right, first of all, about the, there is in research, there is this causation factor. Violence is directly a result of poverty. Like the greater poverty there is, the more violence there is. And we know that based on the research that has been done out there. So when we work to alleviate or to act toward that, we're actually acting toward solving some of these bigger issues that we have. And I think that I'm just to speak to that one piece right there. But to kind of the bigger picture of what you were saying, I guess I first of all think about how people want to feel safe. And how do people define the ways that they feel safe? We have created, in this expanding globalization that's happening, greater feelings of existential anxiety, and people feel less and less safe. And when people feel less safe, they react according to whatever, bases they already have. If they grew up in a community that looked like this, then that's going to be the reflexive reference point. If they grew up with these experiences, that will be the reflexive reference point, or these ideas, these beliefs, or somebody just happens to say something at a certain time that clicks for them, and then they're going to run forward with that. In a space of not feeling safe and not knowing how to create one's own safety inside, I think we're going to continue to fight against the same boogeymen that we have been fighting for so long. We're not going to be able to move out of that. We really have to be able to self-reflect. We really have to be able um, to have a greater capacity to recognize ourselves first, so that we can then see the effects of what we're thinking outside of ourselves. We can't do that without the self-reflection piece. I don't think. That's my perspective and my experience. And that's why, in the work that I have chosen, instead of doing this or this or this that I could do, that's the work that I've chosen to do. And it's very foundational, because, wherever people are going to take it, they can take it any number of places. But the ability to be self-reflective is, I think, this change point that we have, we can start to build into how we meet the world, how we meet the next steps that need to happen.
Well, and I would say more than there's plenty of people, I think, like one of the things that I've observed through the years of watching you with folks is that it's more than self-reflection. It's a ruthless self-honesty. And I'm just going to make that distinction, because I feel like one of the things that I've observed in the activist social justice world is that the ability to be present with the things that we don't want to be true about ourselves or society, that are very uncomfortable and painful to acknowledge. The more we can do that, the less likely we are to reenact that harm. And the more that we are in denial of some of those truths, the more easily we can reenact the harms that we find to be horrifying. And I feel like that that's to me, from the outside, because I do slightly different work with people, but from the outside, I feel like that transformation ends up being the result of recognizing that if I don't want to be part of causing this type of harm, I have to be comfortable seeing where it exists and how I participate in it, even unconsciously. And not to say, oh, like, not to say that that's okay, like, not sitting there being like, let myself off the hook, also not beating myself up, simply acknowledging this is what's happening and this is how I deal with it in a way that doesn't center my pain as the point of the story, right? Like, I don't walk up to someone in a scenario and make my lack of desire to cause harm more harmful, right? Like, there's so it's very nuanced, unfortunately. So I'm probably not going to sum it up particularly well, but but I feel like that's kind of that distinction between what I would call sort of like the self-help industrial complex and actual transformation. Is it is it's genuinely painful at times to really accept that complexity of who we are. I have things that I want to believe are true about myself,
Yeah.
and while my efforts and intentions lead me in that direction, I'm a flawed human. I have absolutely caused harm. I have engaged in behaviors that were not my ideal about myself or the world, whether out of ignorance or selfishness, it has occurred. And until I can hold that reality as part of my self-identity and my story, my denial will cause me to do it to other people. My denial will cause me to perpetuate a system I don't believe in. And my not denial hurts. So, you know,
I think that you characterize that well. I
oh,
it is I think that's the paradox of self-awareness moving towards self-actualization right there. That the more honest I become about myself in all the ways, and honest about the things around me in all the ways, the more I recognize I have a part to play, and yet the honesty is always going to have elements of pain involved in them, right? That I'm not going to, this idea that I'm going to become, enlightened, and I'm not, and woke and whatever. And that's the absence of struggle, the absence of pain is the biggest lie, I think, that gets perpetuated all over the place. And it also, I think that whole idea perpetuates even more problems that we are confronting. Our inability to actually recognize the effects of us on other people, the
mhm,
the insulation and privilege. Instead of actually being able to step outside of that in a real way, to try and see what we aren't forced to see all the time, to actually intentionally try to see and understand what other people's experiences are. And when I teach the work that I do, one of the things I talk about is responsibility to consequences. Now, that comes after I talk about, this idea of radical self-responsibility, that you don't owe anybody anything and they don't owe you anything. So we can get out of the emotional blackmail of things like, oh, I'm going to do good things because then people will see I do good things. Well, we need to get out of that. I'm going to stand for this cause because it's the thing that all the people around me are doing, or because I've learned that it's the right thing, not because I am interacting with the real situation to find where my position, my place is with regard to it, and then standing
mhm,
according to myself for the thing that I know, which means that I could stand alone if I needed to, versus I'm just part of a movement. You see what I mean? Like, if you have a number of people who really know within themselves why they're standing for what they're standing for personally within themselves, that's so much more powerful than a much bigger group that's just following along, in a group think. We have the responsibility to really understand and know for ourselves. But I think that um, in that process of being responsible to consequences, what I'm asking people to look at is how it's the double back challenge to myself, right? So I don't live in my own echo chamber. If I'm
mhm,
responsible to consequences, then I'm taking constant feedback in for what I'm putting out there, and I'm measuring it against my principles, and I'm measuring it against my values, and I'm having to challenge myself continually in ways that could be highly uncomfortable. But I think
mhm,
that's where the real potential for the kind of changes we want starts to come, because I can't be other than I am. I can't, or somewhere other than where I am right now, unless I am in this continual process of, you know, I use the word self-reflection, but you can also say brutal honesty, of
mhm,
recognizing that who I am and my part in the world has a responsibility and also an effect that I need to take responsibility for.
mhm, yeah. Right, exactly, and that responsibility is not, and yeah, well, and one of my, colleagues, was talking about, her work. She does a lot of work with corporations, and her perspective I thought was very interesting in terms of recognizing that, eh, there's accountability, and that's important, and then there's also love and grace, um, and and I don't know, like, it's such a complicated scenario, right? Like, I'm not super into deathbed confessionals because I don't think you can really take responsibility if you don't have an opportunity to take an action to indicate, and an action that is genuinely taking something from you, like, not in a punishment way, but
Yeah.
if I give lip service to something and I'm not really willing to go out of my, like, zone of comfort, am I actually committed? Yeah. Like, I get up at 5 in the morning regularly for my kids. Clearly I was committed to that, but, and so I think it's that, and that's where I think some of this work gets really challenging, is that there aren't any blanket statements. There's not a one size fits all, like, snap our fingers, make it all work, get it better. It's that it really is a day-to-day effort from all of us. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing is this awareness that there, and I think that's part of what as a country we're dealing with in terms of our self-identity, is that we're finally kind of comprehending, and I would say more in a mainstream fashion. I think there's plenty of groups of people that have comprehended this for a very long time, but I would say the mainstream consciousness is slowly starting to understand that we've never really been who we said we were as a country. We've never really been a fully equitable society.
Right.
And
True.
and there's a couple of ways to respond to that. And one of them is to, like, dig in and be like, no. And that's what some folks are doing. And there's another way to say, okay, if that's true, how do we get there? I mean, I think the ideals that were laid down, sure, they maybe need some updating, but for the most part, they seem pretty good to me. What if we just say, all right, well, let's try and make those more true. They've never been true. Okay. Let's take that challenge on and make them true. How do we do that? Um And, I think the Voting Rights Act, to go restart, is a great place to start. I think the ERA, I mean, it's tricky because technically the Constitution says we're all equal. So I don't know, why isn't that enough? Like, but okay, we'll add stuff in to like flesh that out, I guess.
Yeah, but it also has slavery written into it at the same time.
It really does. And that's a problem.
When I think about that, I look at the fact that, symbols matter. I said that earlier, and they really do. And the Constitution is a symbol. It gets taken this way and that way. So things like the ERA, things like rewriting to remove the slavery parts of the Constitution, they matter. They
Yeah,
really
they
matter.
do.
And I'm not saying that's going to solve all the problems, but it's both sides at the same time. You can't,
Yeah.
we've gone this far, and we still have in our founding documents slavery written in. How many other,
Yeah.
Western industrialized nations have slavery written into the operating documents of their countries at this point? And from what I've been able to find, like, it's ours is kind of unique in what we have in that right there, not in a good way. And there's also, as you're talking about this, Aicila, I'm trying to remember. I'm going to have to go back and find it. But there's an index that it comes out annually about, is it freedoms? It
Hmm.
looks at, or maybe it's democracy, like the democratic
Hmm.
principles in action in different countries. And it has all these different ways of rating that. And so
Hmm.
then you look at and you see where a country falls with regard to all of these ideas that we espouse within democratic freedom. And
Hmm.
the US is not near the top of that list.
No, we aren't.
We are
No,
not,
yeah, we
and
aren't.
have
Not
not been.
any. Yeah.
Right. So here we have a country of marketers again, as you said.
Uh-huh.
We're really good at marketing this idea of freedom, but we're rather shitty at being able to implement it in
Yeah.
certain
No.
ways, and
In
certain
certain ways, yeah.
annually, right?
Well, and that's the education piece. So I'll share one of the things that I will share is the truth and conciliation. So we had this woman on the podcast for the BiCurean podcast, and she's doing and so this is probably the most relevant to the truth and conciliation movement. She Dr. Stephanie Spalding decided to start this movement a couple years ago, and it's getting a lot of traction, and I hope it works. And basically, her goal is to get a federal commission
Mm,
to examine both the ways in which our country has treated Black people, as well as the Native American and Indigenous communities that were here when the
yeah.
Europeans came over. And she calls it the truth and conciliation rather than reconciliation, because she said there was no original agreement.
Right.
So you can't reconcile what was never agreed to. We must build a covenant of being through conciliation. We must craft together a sacred agreement if there will be any manifestations of healing.
Beautiful.
And so I really like that that perspective and that awareness of saying, we're all sick of this. Let's be honest. Like no one wants to have this conversation anymore. So let's take this momentum that exists to create a genuine oversight, and to be inclusive and recognize that both Black people and Native people have they didn't have a choice, like that all the other groups that are here that have been discriminated against because it's our thing. They had a choice in that they came, but these two groups were kind of ripped from their world or disrupted in their world by the folks that showed up. And so we have to start with acknowledging that and say, all right, that happened. And now what is a sacred agreement to move forward? And everybody wants to start with moving forward, which, yes, cool, but we can't actually move forward until we acknowledge and do something to engage with what occurred, and in saying like this just wasn't the right thing.
Right.
And we need to take responsibility for that impact to the best of our ability,
Right.
and then say, and what does that look like to allow us to move forward? And so I like that. I like what she's doing because she's got so much, but that awareness that it requires some kind of like actual, national oversight engagement to say, this is actually what we need to do to build a future,
Right.
and the future that I think we all want that, but the thing that I think it is it's like it's a little, we were talking about with transformation, it feels uncomfortable. And for people who have been able to avoid the impact of some of these systems, and they don't really avoid it, but they can avoid the direct feeling of that impact. um they might see it as taking on some kind of discomfort, but the reality is that if I'm in denial, about something that's causing harm that I'm part of, I'm impacted by it, whether I'm aware of it or not, whether I see it or not, whether I understand it or not, I'm still impacted. So it's more, like you were saying, like it's that awareness of the impact and the awareness of our influence. Like I may not be able to solve this problem in a large way. That's okay. These are the things I can do. These are the ways I can show up and participate in making the world more inclusive and, more what I believe in, my values of community and engagement.
I think that there's that, you're right, and there's that discomfort where we want to insulate ourselves. Also, we have to take responsibility for how our status is the easiest word I can use. I mean, there's so much more involved in it, but how our status is sitting on top of others who don't, um,
Yeah.
who haven't been given the justice, right? And not only that, or the recognition. And so, or that they haven't, and I'll say life chances as well. I mean, we're going to get into a whole different set of things here, but until I can recognize that I have been participating in perpetuating a truly unjust situation just by virtue of um, the privileges or the status or successes that I enjoy, and I'm not saying that we should feel guilty. I'm saying we should feel responsible, right? That's one of the things I talk about again and again when somebody comes up against, this process of coming, to forgiveness with another person. I'm like, stop feeling guilty. It serves nobody. It serves nobody. Instead, feel your responsibility. When you feel your responsibility, there's a path forward. And I feel like that's what we have to do with the results of our privilege, right? That, for all of us, it doesn't matter who, what, where, all of us in any circumstance, we have the opportunity to really get honest with ourselves about for me, I look around and I have that very clear feeling that I want everyone to succeed. And it's not that I'm responsible to make that all happen, but I can make sure that that's where my intention is. How do I show up? I remember, I was spending time, I was living in Bali and really recognizing my privilege as I was, there for that period of time, getting to know and forming relationships with the local people in the community that I was in, and the people who were there, working, that even served me where I was staying at the time. And for me, that it was uncomfortable because there was this built-in status, right, differential, and it's very uncomfortable. So how do I dismantle that status differential? How do
Mhm.
I actively show up to that and make mistakes and break it down piece by piece until I can feel like we are actually looking at each other person to person and real relationships have formed. And in fact, I really have felt myself able to do that in these different places that I have lived again and again. But it takes time and it takes
Mhm.
investment, and this ability for me to know that I'm going to make mistakes. I made mistakes. Money does not solve second world problems or third world problems. We have to show up, and I figured that out pretty quickly. And instead, I would show up to the relationships, and I would show up. I remember one woman in particular, Wei and Sana. She's so smart, young, was married young. I don't know how far she went in her schooling, but her intelligence was so quick, so sharp. She handled the books at this guest house that I was staying at, and I watched her manage everything, even though she wasn't in charge. I watched her just see it, get it, and like implement and make things work really, really well. And she did it just kind of moving in the space that she had been assigned to to be.
Mhm.
So I spent time with her and with others, but I talked to her and I spoke to her about her intelligence. I mean, most of the time people have no idea. And as a woman as well, right? Like that was just so important for me to say in this little village, look, you are so smart. And look at this is what I see, and start to point it out so that she can see I'm watching her. Let's talk about what's possible. Because she said, well, I don't, she could only see her path being working in this particular capacity long term. And my conversations with her ended up being, well, what would you like to do? What would you really want to do? How would you go about that? And spending the time with her over and
Mhm.
over again, giving her some assignments to go, write things out and draw things out for herself and come back and let's talk about it and keep talking about it and keep talking about it. Well, as a result of those conversations over and over again in the months, in the couple years that I was there, at different times, she got her family together and they created and launched their own guest houses. And they did it, she saw what she was a part of already and said, I can't do that. It's too big. I don't have the money. I don't have the money. I don't have the money. And I said, well, let's talk about what you can do. And so we started with the beginnings of what she could do. And what I see in that is that she saw herself more in this powerful way, and her ability to create what she thought um, was far removed from her, was very separate from her capacities, and then to build it and create it and develop it more and to make it happen, which she did, right? I
Mhm.
look at that
Yeah.
and I knew at the time it was not, oh, let me give you the money and we'll create that, right? It was her knowing inside, and that requires relationship. That requires me dismantling these artificial status ideas so that we are straight across. She doesn't look at me and say, oh, you've got some magic and maybe you can give me a little bit of it. Instead, for me to say, no, your value and my value are the same. Let's have the conversations and let's see what I can do with what I have to help you create what you want, or what,
Mhm.
doors that have been closed to you in certain
Yeah.
ways.
Well, and that's I work with an organization called Harmony Voices Foundation, and that's really one of the main differences between, like, their work, and there's so many because Alicia, the founder, his amazing. But she, one of the things she really talks about is that like there's a dominant sort of like European white culture perspective that's like, I'm going to come in and I know best and I'll tell you what's happening. And if you, like you said, if you have the kind of status and privilege that like goes along with that, you can come in and be like, this is how we're doing it. And for sure, there are times when that whole command and control approach has its place. And the step one actually is what you're talking about. You go in, you make a relationship, and you find out from the community what is it. Assume they have the wisdom they need to know. That they may not have certain information, like this tool or this technology exists that potentially can be a part of your solution. So sure, bring that information so people have a full spectrum of options. However, there's this other piece of, just because we come from that, Western experience doesn't mean we actually have a solution. These folks in their communities have probably a lot of solutions, especially if they are given a full access to information, technology, and tools that may not be immediately available or obvious. And that's where I see like that partnership being so successful is having that respect for each participant, like what they bring to the community conversation, possibility. Um, and it makes a difference because it starts with, I mean, a friend of mine just went to the doctor and it was terrible. The doctor completely dismissed their experience. And the thing was, like, when I think about it, it really was, they didn't feel heard. Like, it's possible that the doctor was right on. I doubt it because they didn't really pay much attention to what was like in front of them. However, maybe they're super intuitive. Maybe they just know like that. I've run into those folks, but they didn't create a relationship of trust with the patient. So that it was a waste of everybody's time because they did not take just a few minutes to say, hey, what do you think's happening? What is going to make you feel like this, meeting between us was a successful endeavor? Like, and that it's funny because I think we all know we want that. And yet it could be very easy, I think, to fall into a place where you're just like, I'm working, whatever. And just remember to step back. If my job involves people, I need to treat them like people. Turns out.
Right. No, so good. I think that it's essential that we, for me, I measure, part of my internal measure of fulfillment and success is the space of connection, of people actually really feeling connected and heard and seen. And that just feels like, I don't know where or how I wrote that into how I engage, but I feel like it has led me forward powerfully in ways to, as I grew up with this idea, my parents would always say, well, if you're going to borrow a tool from the neighbor, always leave things better than you found them. So if the tool comes, and it's not that sharp, sharpen it and leave it sharper, when you give it back, that idea. And we can show up that way in the world. And that really, I think that idea really allows us to constantly be learning, to step outside our own bubbles, so that we can show up in more effective and powerful ways from the sphere that we are in. But it also it gives us this deeper sense of our own our own fulfillment inside, because we get that when we connect. And so to know that I haven't compromised who I am in this space to be able to connect, even if somebody radically disagrees with me on certain things, politics or otherwise, because that seems to be the hottest one right now, that still I'm able to show up to wanting that connection and working in whatever ways I can to even get just a small amount of that. We both walk away with more than we came in with when we're able to reach for that and try to figure out how to get there, how to make that possible. So
I love that. I'm going to close out, but what's up with you and the Center for Transformational Influence? Anything you want to share with folks about how they can engage, or what's your next event? I don't know.
So, thank you. Well, I will just say that my center has an open front door. It's an online community, and you're welcome to come. I would love to have you. We've just been getting started, so we're just developing the culture of this online community. it has a lot of the types of engagement of social media, but without the the dopamine hits of, kind of coerciveness that social media can have. It's very much about forming relationships, and we're working to build that. So you're welcome to join me in my online community center for transformational influence, and I will have the link there. Also, I am this weekend, Saturday, I'm leading my first wake up call event that I've done in probably about almost 2 years. And that is focused on boundaries, our wake up call for ourselves with boundaries right now in our lives. It could be relationships, ourselves, our professions, our businesses, whatever that is. This is the way that we focus in and learn to
Mhm.
make things.
Actually, I can. There we go. Jump! Look at that. And so people can check that out. And
people, people can join in person, or they can join virtually as well.
okay. Yeah, and I'll make sure there's a link in this, and then we're going to do, so this isn't technically the first official BiCurean Consulting podcast. They're going to be about a half an hour on Mondays around lunchtime, depending on when folks can join in. And my first official one is going to be with Carmell. So it'll look the same, but it'll be different, just like we talked earlier. But sometimes things look away, but are different. So I hope you'll join us. That'll be February 14th, also at noon. And I'll have a little bit more of a theme. And I'll post that up here in the next week or so people can sign up if they want to. And whatever you do today, I hope that you can take some aspect of what you feel in terms of your own sense of how to commit to the legacy that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to leave our country as a gift and was, murdered for, in terms of how do we stand up and be part of our communities in a way that makes a difference to really make them work for everyone. And not just today, maybe multiple times in the year. And definitely, I think Carmell's Center is a great place to learn how to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with the truths of your life. So I definitely recommend it. And I hope you'll join us. And then the BiCurean podcast will start again. We're thinking February or March. And engages obviously a slightly different way on these topics. And I do that with my co-host, Eric. So happy Martin Luther King Day. Keep equity in your heart every day. And thank you for being here.
All right. Thank you so much, Aicila. Thank you. And thank you for providing this. So it's wonderful. Thanks, everybody.